So my name is Dustin Thompson. I am the Volunteer and Community Outreach Coordinator for the Delaware Sierra Club. And I'm joined by the wonderful AR Siders this lovely afternoon, to talk about managed retreat. So Siders, you want to give a little introduction?
Yeah, thanks for having me here, Dustin. So I'm A.R. Siders. I go by my last name as a nickname. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Delaware. I'm in the Biden School of Public Policy, the Department of Geography and Spatial Sciences, and I'm at the Disaster Research Center, which I always say just helps illustrate how really interconnected these issues are, that you can't pigeonhole them into one department and try to answer them. And yeah, we're here to talk about flood risk, about managed retreat. Managed retreat is one of the climate adaptation strategies that I primarily study. And what I mean by managed retreat is the purposeful movement of people or assets, so buildings, roads, other infrastructure, away from hazards. This most often happens as a result of flooding, coastal erosion, sea level rise, but it's something risky, and then we move things away from it. This can be that we've built in places maybe we shouldn't have, or it may be that we built in places that historically have been safe, but now because of climate change are no longer safe. So I study how we try to unbuild in places that maybe we shouldn't have buildings.
So how did you personally kind of get invested into this area?
Yeah, so I did my postdoc. Well, I did a postdoc at the Center for Climate Change Law at Columbia University in New York. And I started there in September of 2012, right before Hurricane Sandy hit New York. So while my advisor and I were trying to figure out what we were going to do around climate change, what my project was going to be, Sandy made that pretty clear. I was going to work on post-disaster recovery. And right after that, there were a number of professors at Columbia who were talking a lot about retreat and about maybe we shouldn't rebuild in some of these communities. And I heard a lot of local officials saying, well, we can't retreat, we can't unbuild, that's not American, that's illegal, that's something we don't do here. And well, I'm a lawyer, so I knew that wasn't illegal, and I knew that we had done it all over the United States. And so I spent the rest of that year collecting case studies of, here's where we've done retreat, here's how it's been done, here are the legal tools that you can use to make retreat happen or to make it easier to do in the future. And that just sort of started a really long interest with how this process works, and then why we have these perceptions that it doesn't happen, because it actually does happen all over the place and it happens all the time and we just don't talk about it. And so how do we change that by talking about it more and sort of normalizing it?
Yeah, why do you think that is, that there's so much pushback, in particularly, I would say, in the United States on, just building something back somewhere else?
Yeah, it's amazing. So one part is that people are really attached where they live, right? There's a reason you live in the house you do, everyone on this call, right? You live there. Maybe you love the neighborhood, maybe you grew up there, maybe it's the only place you could afford, maybe it's because it's close to your job, maybe it's because it's close to some park you love or something like that. All of these factors go into finding that place that you want to live. And to suddenly try to say, okay, not here, now find another place, right? Anyone who's moved, you know how big of a hassle that is, how hard it is to find a new place that is just as good as the old one. And so I think there's this resistance to, well, no place will be able to replace this. And especially for communities that are built up around the coast, right? Or people have a really long standing attachment to the coast, or maybe being a coastal person, like I'm a beach person, that's my identity. This can really get tied up in people's personal identities, that they're, on the water. I grew up in Minnesota, so I grew up on Lake Superior, right? I still have a sweatshirt that says Lake Girl, because this is like part of my identity, right? Is I'm Minnesotan and I grew up on the lakes and on the water, and that's part of who I am. And so when we move, if you lose any of that, it can become really difficult for people to fathom that. Another part of it is that we are really bad as humans at thinking about risk. And we're particularly bad in the United States about talking about risk. Like for example, we talk about a 100-year flood or a 100-year storm. And a lot of people think that means that this is a storm that happens once every 100 years. When really what it means is that it's a storm that has a 1% chance of happening in any given year. And that's really different, because a 1% chance of happening any given year, over the course of a 30-year mortgage, that means you have a 1 in 4 chance of your home flooding. If I said you have a 1 in 4 chance of your home flooding over the course of a 30-year mortgage, that sounds really different from a 100-year storm. And it's the same math, it's the same flood, it's the same floodplain, it's just the way we phrase it is so different. And so we have difficulty in talking about risk in a way that makes it understandable to people. And then we all have these cognitive biases. We all think, oh yeah, I know terrible things happen, but they're not going to happen to me. right? Sea level is a really big problem. That's a problem in Florida or somewhere else, right? It's not a problem here. It's not a problem for me, even though Delaware is an incredibly low-lying state, right, with lots of coastal land. We somehow convince ourselves that we're the exception to the rule, that we will be safe even if something horrible happens. And so that makes it really difficult for us to imagine that, oh my gosh, yeah, my house could be the one that is destroyed in that next storm, or my house is the one that will be flooded over and over and over again. You know, we have one flood and we tend to think, oh, that was horrible, but no, I'm sure that's done and it won't happen again, right? Until we get flooded again and again and again. And so it's this intense connection to where we are, paired, I think, with this real difficulty about understanding the risks we face, they make it really hard for someone to say, yeah, it makes sense to move. It makes more sense to move than it does to elevate my house or to, you know, put a seawall in or anything else. And I think that's, you know, we're seeing more people come to that realization, but it's hard and it's an intensely personal decision. So it's really difficult to try to convince people at mass scale because they have to kind of grapple with it as an individual.
I think there, you know, I think I'm a little bit rough on America ideology sometimes, when I think it is a little bit more a human way of thinking about things as well. We do get very attached to things, but I think and you'll probably see this in other countries as well, but you definitely see it in the United States where you don't like, there's a huge population in the United States. They're like, government should not be telling me what to do, right? If I want to rebuild my house here, then you give me my insurance check and I'm rebuilding here. And we also are really bad at sunk costs, right?
Yes.
You and I have talked about this before. We're really bad with like, oh, we've already put in all this effort and all this time and money to build a city here, right? We can't then move it inland or redevelop somewhere else. Like we just need to build better infrastructure here to protect the sea level rise. I was on a call last night, actually, and the call was actually about cement manufacturing, but they were talking about adaptation to sea level rise. And they showed a picture of a 17-foot high cement wall that they wanted to put down like into the water, into the floor of the waterway at this place to help protect the city that would be on the other side of the wall, right? So rather than trying to slowly kind of migrate away from the coast, right, they're like, no, we got to stay here and let's dig down into the earth and extend a wall up above the water line for 17 feet. And it kind of cracked me up a little bit, like in a kind of satirical way, that you know, when we ever talk about wind turbines, right? One of the big things we get pushed back on is like, oh my God, I'm gonna see
They're so ugly.
Yeah, I'm gonna see the blinking red lights at night, right? But somehow the 17-foot cement wall that was 4 feet thick, totally fine. I was just like blown away by that kind of, wow, that's like so American.
It's amazing the things people will sometimes love and accept and sometimes hate, right? Like I've heard communities complain about dunes because they block my view of the ocean, right? They're preventing the water from getting into my basement, but they block my view of the ocean. And so you hate that. Or, oh, I really need to live in this town because I really value being close to the ocean and being able to see the ocean. So we should build a 17-foot concrete wall between me and the ocean. Like that makes sense. Right. And it's one of those, I struggle sometimes to try to put myself in their shoes. Like, why is this preferable? Why is it better to build a 17-foot wall that blocks your view of the ocean than to move a mile inland? Because sometimes we're talking about really long distances, right? Some places, especially really low-lying areas, we might be talking about 20 miles. But many places we're talking about 1 mile, right? Or 2 miles or 5 miles. I'm not suggesting everyone move to Iowa, right? I'm suggesting everyone move a little bit inland onto the nearest high ground. And so it is always an interesting, like, why is that and I think there's something, I think it goes back to the psychology, and I'm not a psychologist. I have been seeking out psychologists and behavioral experimental experts to try to work on this because I think there's such a big psychological component. Like, oh, there's a wall in front of me, I must be safe. And we know from experience that that's also a false sense of security in a lot of times, right? Japan had massive floods after tsunamis knocked over the walls, right? All the flooding in Katrina happened after the levees were breached. Like a lot of the worst flooding we see actually happens when people think they're safe because of the walls, they build in behind them, and then the wall doesn't, it fails. It doesn't succeed. And so I think there's a psychology about feeling safe behind that wall that isn't true, but it is interesting, yeah, how people make those calculations. And
maybe we need to like rephrase kind of how we're saying, how we're selling property, right? If we sell property a mile in, say you're investing in the future, this will be oceanfront property, right? Buy now on the cheap. And then in 10 years.
Actually, we see real estate speculators doing this. They're buying up property in places they think will be beneficial. I know people who are buying property in northern Minnesota because it will have water and it won't be ridiculously hot. In 20 years, it won't even have that cold of winters in 20 years, probably. Maybe very nice. I shouldn't say this. I don't, I love Minnesota. I don't want everyone to move there, but probably will be a good place to live. So we do see real estate speculators already taking a role in that, but on that information and the selling component is a great point. So the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law, where I was working several years before this, and the Natural Resources Defense Council came out with a report where they actually graded all of the coastal states based on how well they disclose risk to homeowners in floodplains. And it's remarkable. Delaware, I think, gets a B. All right, so we're doing pretty well. We're not amazing, but we do pretty well because as of someone who recently was home shopping in Delaware, they tell you things like, oh yeah, you're in the floodplain, you would have to buy flood insurance. So other states might get a C because they'll tell you that you have to buy flood insurance, but they won't tell you that this home has been damaged by flood 10 times in the last decade, right? They won't tell you that damage history. And Florida, actually, I think has a D, I want to say. Anyway, they're one of the very red states that doesn't do very well on this map because they don't disclose flood risk, right? They don't tell you that you have to buy flood insurance. They don't tell you that you're in the flood zone. They don't tell you that, I know maybe they're assuming that you're moving to Florida, you're living on the coast, you understand that you should be at flood risk, but it's amazing. It's a little heartbreaking when I read the news, you see all of these stories coming out that say, I would never have bought this house if I'd known, right? I moved in and 6 months later, it was flooded, or all the remodeling we did was destroyed because I didn't know that this house was at risk of flooding. And then we moved in and here it is. So I think sometimes people are tempted to say, oh, if you moved into a flood zone, you should have known better, and that's on you, homeowner. And it's possible we could get to that point in the future where we could really agree that homeowners do know that. But right now, we have no reason to think that homeowners know what their risk exposure looks like.
Yeah, when I've listened to a few webinars and read some things on, managed retreat and flood risk and that sort of thing. And one of the, I think it was a webinar, but I might be wrong, but at any rate, they said basically, if your road is named, right, like River Road or Lake Drive or something, any nautical water related sort of name, just go ahead and buy yourself flood insurance because you're probably going to need it. And I'm like, that's probably pretty accurate, right? If your neighborhood, right, is Arbor Point or River Run or something like that, right, then they do pick those names generally because of geographic things that are in that area, right? Or were in that area. I think the most ironic is usually when it was like a forest and now the neighborhood's called Oak Forest, right? Because there was an oak forest there that they demolished to put in this stinking neighborhood.
There's one oak tree left somewhere.
Exactly, right.
We left one standard.
And so the point was kind of like, if that's usually how those names come about. So kind of pay attention to that. And if you're, you're not going to see like River Run out in the middle of the desert in Arizona, right? You're going to see it like along the riverfront or something to that effect. So it's an interesting little tidbit that you just reminded me of. So do you feel like Delaware is doing a pretty good job here on this or still some room for improvement?
Oh, I think states can always improve. I mean, for example, the fact that flood disclosure is at a B, right? Like, wouldn't we all like to aim for an A and just be really transparent about what risk is, right? Delaware is still building quite a lot in the floodplain. I know that a lot of Delaware is in the floodplain, so it's often difficult to say where can we build if not in the floodplain. But at least one calculation suggests that Delaware is building 2.5 times faster in the 10-year floodplain. So a floodplain that has a 10% chance of flooding every given year, building 2.5 times faster there than they are outside of it. So I think there's a lot that can be done. Now, maybe they're building very elevated and they're building, smartly in those areas. But that's a statistic that concerns me because I don't know enough of the details about how those homes are being built. I'm concerned about that. I'm concerned about long-term plans with beach nourishment. I know that that's a very popular strategy and it works, but I personally don't think it's a very long-term strategy, right? I think any kid can tell you who's built a sandcastle and watched it be washed away by the ocean that there's only so many times you can build it up with sand and watch it be washed away before it gets frustrating and expensive. And eventually, at least according to the US Army Corps of Engineers, we're going to run out of sand to put on the beach. So, this is fine for some decades, but it's probably not a really long-term strategy. So I hope to see really more long-term strategies. And by long-term, I really do mean planning for 2100 or longer. And the reason I think we should be planning very far ahead is we're building infrastructure that's very likely to be there a century from now, right? We're still working with some infrastructure and some buildings that are here from 1900. It's very likely that in 2100 they will be dealing with some of the infrastructure that we are building now. And so I think we have to be thinking that far in advance.
Yeah, I mean, my house was built in 1950, right? And so.
Yeah, so don't you, if you're building a new house today, you should be asking, what is the flood risk going to be like in 50 years? And this is a challenge with FEMA flood maps, for example, even if they're very new and updated, that they don't take sea level rise into account. They're all based on historic flood risk. And so this is a problem when we're using maps that as soon as they're created, right, the year after, they're out of date because the climate is changing, because the flood risk is changing. So as soon as these maps are created, we're using them to build infrastructure that we expect to be here for many decades, but they don't tell us what the risk is going to be like over those decades. And so this is a major challenge in terms of how do we think about that? And so states can play a big role there. Counties can too, but states especially can play a big role. And I think Delaware has done some fantastic job in terms of getting its data together and really thinking about its risk analysis. So I know there's a lot of scientists who are working on that, and I think it actually has done a good job of trying to analyze its risk. And now we need to see more work on how those risks are being translated into decision making. And I want to caveat all of this by saying that I moved to Delaware 2 years ago, so I am learning about Delaware, but by no means do I have the definitive knowledge on this is what's happening right in Delaware. So if you know of Delaware doing a great job somewhere that I don't know about, please tell me, because I'm always glad to learn about.
I would say I go the other way. I know some parts of Delaware that are doing a really bad job about it, but yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think it would be great if we had a lot more statewide, like uniform regulations around building and development and things like, because they do, the state kind of does leave a lot of that. There's some bare minimums on some things, but by and large, the states kind of leave it to the county. One county tends to do a little bit better, but has less, let's be honest, less beachfront property that they can soak in a lot of property value from. Compared to Newcastle compared to Sussex County. So
well, I will say I learned this today, so I don't know all the details, but I was very surprised. I see some questions about flood insurance in the chat, and so today I looked at the FEMA has announced some of their projected impacts of their flood risk 2.0, so their flood insurance revisions. They've put out state information pages, and so I looked at Delaware's, and I was surprised by the finding that only 11 communities in Delaware, so one of those is Newcastle County, so it's a whole county, but only 11 communities in Delaware are members of the community rating system. So the community rating system is the community takes steps to reduce its flood risk, and in return, people who live in that community pay a reduced flood insurance premium. So only 11 communities across Delaware state are involved in this program. And what was more concerning to me is that, so these communities are ranked on a scale from 10 to 1, 1 being the best, 10 being you get no benefits at all, so 9 being, most of them are ranked as an 8. So I think that tells me that if most of the communities many communities are not participating, and those that are participating are at an 8, right, that tells me that there's a lot of room where they could improve. Now, I don't know what steps they've taken, which ones they haven't, to be at an 8 and not a 7 or a 6 or etc. But that tells me there's room for them to improve, and I'd be curious to know, I'd love to know more about what's stopping them, what's preventing them from taking those steps to become, a step.
What are the barriers? Yeah, I mean, and I wanted to talk about flood insurance because the reason why I got kind of interested in this, again, I was listening to these webinars and hearing about kind of what are some of the barriers and the policy barriers specifically to do, climate-based migration. Particularly around flooding, though, and I know you and I have talked about this, that there's this restriction that, by and large, that if your home gets destroyed by flooding, a lot of flood insurance, they don't pay you to move and build that house somewhere else. You have to rebuild in that same footprint to get the money that you're covered for. So, it's just but I'd like to kind of cover in general this question that Carol brought up, what can be done about flood insurance? And she asked on the federal level.
Yeah, so, okay, there's so much to dig into there. So the flood insurance is one of the reasons it's undergoing reform right now is that it's been criticized for decades. So ever since Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans and the Gulf Coast, 2005, right, the National Flood Insurance Program has owed billions more dollars than it brings in every year. So it's in the red. Even though Congress has forgiven $16 billion worth of that debt, it's still, I think at the moment it's $25 billion in debt. So it's still way backlogged, right? And it's paying out far more than it's bringing in. And part of the reason is that this whole program started because insurance companies didn't want to insure homes in the floodplain. They were too risky, right? And I think that's a really telling point. Like if an insurance agent can't figure out how to make money off of your risk, right, you must be really risky. Like if they can't figure out how to profit off this, it must be bad. So this was back in the 60s or earlier than that, because in the 60s, they started this federal program to sort of step in and say, okay, we can't leave homeowners with no flood insurance, so we're going to step in and have this federal program. And unfortunately, they ended up subsidizing it, so people don't pay the full amount of their risk, right? They're not paying the same amount that they take out. And so risk rating 2.0, and there were reforms in 2012 and all kinds of steps along the way. People have tried to reform this. But it's really tricky because on the one hand, we want people to pay more because we want them to pay for the full amount of their risk. On the other hand, we don't want to price out low-income communities. We don't want to create a coast that is only affordable to the ultra-rich. Yeah. So right now, people might be paying somewhere around $1,000 a year for flood insurance. And if we went up to full amounts of risk, it might be more like $25,000 of a year for flood insurance for full risk in some areas, not everywhere on the coast, but in some areas. In some areas, FEMA calculates actually your rates might go down because the home's been elevated or because new storm drains, et cetera, have been put in. But this could be a really big deal. So there's this tension, right, between wanting it to be affordable and wanting it to actually reflect the risk. And in some ways, I think this is where moving back becomes part of the solution, right? What do you do about a lot of these homes that are too risky for anyone to reasonably afford staying there and paying the insurance? Well, maybe that suggests that they shouldn't be there, and that instead we should be moving them back, right? 1 mile, 2 miles, 5 miles, whatever it is, to be in a place where that risk is lower and is affordable and can be maintained. So anyway, the flood insurance program has been a huge issue for years. Really excited to see 2.0 come out. Curious to see how FEMA addresses it and how much of the problem it will solve. It's still going to have challenges though, right? Because those flood insurance rates are based on historic damage and not on climate change projections, so they'll always be a bit out of date. FEMA has talked about, and there's a lot of push on reforms. Can we get states, as you just mentioned, states to do more about building codes? All right, instead of building just to the historic base flood elevation, could we require people to build more, build in some slack so that as sea levels rise or as we get more rainfall and floods, we have some room to adapt? Can we do things now that will make things safer in the future? And this gets into another big tension, which is that lots of, the United States, we're a federalist society, right? We have national government, state government, and local government, and a lot of local governments want local control, right? We want people to have a say in their government, and we want them to have control over their local communities, and we don't want the feds coming in and saying, this is how you will build your homes. We don't want that. And so how do we, on the one hand, we want the feds to be able to come in and say, you have to build to this code to be safe. And on the other hand, we don't, because we want to maintain that independence. And this goes back to something you said, Dustin, earlier about like, people really don't want the government to tell them what to do, right? I should be able to do what I want to on my property. And this is also another tension in disaster, which we see all the time, right? Is that people say, don't tell me what to do. I'm going to do what I want. But then as soon as a disaster hits, where's my payout? Where's the money? Please come help me, right? And so there's, again, a tension there in terms of, yes, we want you to be able to do what you want. On the other hand, if we know that we as a society are going to come in and pay for the recovery, pay for the rebuilding, pay for, insurance payouts, then maybe you should have to build to a safer standard, right? Take some more precautions. And worse, if you're going to turn around and sell it to some other family without telling them about the risk that they're facing, right? Then we definitely want you to have to do something to keep them safe. So there's a lot that could be done, but at some point it hits these one of the reasons it hasn't happened is because there are these really difficult problems at the core.
Yeah, and Yul, and hopefully I'm pronouncing your name right. Yul mentioned that if the house is built 18 inches higher than the base flood elevation, how does that impact their risk, and could they potentially have the property removed from the flood map or not have to buy a flood insurance or something to that degree? But so you're kind of alluding to that as well, right? If we put in stricter building codes, what impact does that then have on policy?
Yeah, and this raises another tension, right? Because homes that are built new and built to better building codes are often more expensive. So in towns that are struggling to have affordable housing, there's always, again, there's that sort of tension. And this is more concerning in some places than others, right? But a lot of places in the United States are facing an affordable housing crisis. So how do we increase things like elevation, increase safer homes, hurricane standards, especially in the Gulf and the southeast the US, without pricing out parts of our society, right? And this is one of the things that makes flood management so difficult, is that we want to treat it like an engineering problem. We want to say that it's a problem of the water flows here and we just need engineering solutions to divert the water here, here, or here. But it's actually a really social problem. It comes down to things like, well, what's our affordable housing situation look like? And hey, what's our minimum wage? And can people actually afford to live on minimum wage? Can they afford housing in this area based on what that is? And what's our thought on historic injustices? And do we have a history of racial segregation that we need to undo in certain areas? Or do we have these other historic issues we need to handle? And so we want to treat it like an engineering problem, but it's a social problem. And those social problems are always really naughty because there's no one clear, this is the best answer. Right? It's like you can't run an optimization algorithm and come up with the one best engineering answer. You have to have all these different perspectives and people who will different, debate what the right answer is.
Yeah, you've mentioned, we've talked before, and you've mentioned some of the equity issues, and you've hit a number of them already. But one that you had mentioned to me in the past that I actually was just having a conversation on this morning, actually, was in managed retreat in terms of buyback or buyouts or people when you buy property. And so I'd love for you to kind of talk about some of the issues you've seen, because we've had those conversations here in Delaware too.
Yeah, so buyout programs, the ones that are most studied are FEMA funded. So FEMA, after a major disaster, or sometimes before a disaster, mostly after a disaster, the local government says, hey, we have some homes that flood so frequently, usually it's flood, that we apply to FEMA for money. We then come back and we offer to buy out those homes from the homeowners. The homeowners get to decide whether or not they want to accept it. It's supposed to be voluntary. And then if they agree, the town usually demolishes the home. Sometimes it's in good condition and they can relocate it, but usually it's damaged and they just demolish the home. The homeowner takes that check and goes and buys another house and moves somewhere else. So this is the way it's supposed to work. There are all kinds of challenges in this though, because everything from in the United States, the communities that are damaged the most during disasters tend to be low income and they tend to be racial minorities, right? So certain communities are getting more damage than other communities. They may be in riskier places, right? Places where wealthy whites didn't want to build back in the 50s. And so redlining put Black neighborhoods into those areas. Or they could be places that just have older housing stocks, so it's not as up to building codes, so it's less safe, but it's cheaper. And so lower income neighborhoods maybe are more exposed. So the damage is different. The ability of people to find housing. So, or let's say if those homes, if you are a lower income resident and someone offers to purchase your home, you might be sitting there thinking, well, I don't want to move. I love this place, right? We talked about place connection, like I'm deeply rooted in this place. I have so many good friends here. Maybe my family's here, my job's right here, my kids are in school here. I don't want to move. But the alternative is that my house was severely damaged and FEMA is going to make me raise my house up in elevation so that it's safe for the future. And they're only going to pay for half that cost. So I'm going to have to take out a second mortgage to try to elevate the home. Or I can take this offer and sell my house to the government, right? And if you're wealthier, you may be able to do that. You may be able to raise the funds to elevate the home. You may be able to take out that extra mortgage, you may be able to deal with that. But if you're lower income, you probably don't. And so it's going to be a real struggle. And this goes back into lots of reforms, right? There are reforms being suggested where FEMA should offer more money to try to cover the cost of elevations, things like that. But this is always going to be a challenge. So when we say that these choices are voluntary, it's always a question of, well, how voluntary is it really? Right? And then even if this family says, okay, great, I'm going to take the buyout. Maybe I even want to move. I didn't like this house anyway, flooded all the time. I want to move. I sell my house to the government. Well, where else can I afford to buy a house? Right? If I'm lower income, I probably was renting or purchased one of the lower value homes in the area. And if I'm in an area with an affordable housing shortage, which is lots of the United States, what else can I afford to buy? or to rent. And so do I end up having to move very far away, or not very far, but do I have to move farther away than someone who has more money would have more choices about where they could go? And so this introduces another equity problem in terms of where do people go? And this is a real challenge because we don't know like where people go. So FEMA has funded the purchase of about 45,000 homes all over the United States over the last 30 years. So that's every state except Hawaii has done this. So even Delaware has used this program at some point in the last 30 years. And we don't have records of where people went. So we don't know. We have a few case studies, one from Houston, one from New York, but those are very dense urban environments. So, those have a lot of housing pressures. It's not clear if the same patterns would play out in Delaware as they do in New York City. All right, it might be very different. And we just don't have that data. So I know there's a lot of proposals and people trying to figure out how we get that data, how we find out where people went, how can we track in future, where do people go after buyouts, how can we even help them? New Jersey has a big buyout program called Blue Acres. They have one for Green Acres too, but Blue Acres is the one that focuses on coasts and river flooding homes. And they actually pair every person who's thinking about selling their home with a consultant who can help them through the real estate process, through the sale, through finding new homes. And they're very concerned about which neighborhoods they offer to make purchases in, right? Should we offer to purchase homes in this neighborhood if we know that those residents won't be able to find comparable housing? Right, so can we help them find comparable housing, but also maybe we shouldn't make the offer in the first place, which creates its own ethical issues, right? Should you offer or should you not? Becomes a huge problem. But it's like, again, this becomes a problem not because the flooding issue, but because of all the other social issues that are connected, right? Because of the income wealth disparities, because of the housing shortages, because of all these other social issues that don't have anything to do with flood, but they make it that much more difficult to try to deal with flood through this process.
I've got a good one for you from Facebook.
Yeah.
Cesar asked, what do you think is the most worthwhile cultural, I think social fits in here as well, change or effort that can be attempted to remove barriers to long-term solutions? And how do we build a consensus of it as a political priority?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a really great question. So this one's tricky. One of the reasons I think that this has to be a change in the way we think about climate adaptation. And so I think this is something that needs to be happening with government officials at every single level, but this is also a journalist thing. This is also a scientist thing. This is also any community leader thing, right? This is a messaging thing. Because I think one of the ways we've been thinking about climate change and climate change adaptation is that climate adaptation is about keeping everything the same in the face of climate change. Like the climate is going to change, but somehow our way of life is going to stay exactly the same. And instead, if we could think about it as everything is going to change, no matter what, even if we solved climate change tomorrow, right, and it stopped, the world is still going to change. Like our world does not look like it did in 1900. And in many respects, that's a good thing, right? I'm a woman, that's a really good thing. Right? Because that's the reason my grandmother tells me that was not a good time. So there are a lot of good that can come from change. And so if we could think about it as an opportunity, not oh, this horrible thing is going to happen and we're so afraid. And what we have to do is react out of fear to try to preserve our way of life in the face of this threat. But instead say, okay, we want to keep some things the same. Let's figure out what those things are. We definitely want to change some things, right? We probably want to address systemic sexism, racism, and other sources of discrimination, right? We probably want to change some other things like maybe wealth inequality, or maybe, I don't know, whatever we want to change in our society, right? Whatever you're thinking, yeah, I really want to fix that. We should fix that. And then there's a lot of things that people probably don't care about that are going to change on their own and that we won't have control over, and that will be okay. So how do we do that? I think that's the puzzle I've been trying to figure out. I think that's what needs to happen is we have to have this mind shift. And I think that comes from a lot of messaging. Like maybe this is how journalists cover the issue, right? We stop talking about the fear and the horror and the disasters and everything terrible that's going to happen as a result of climate change. And we start talking about like social change in a more optimistic way. And I think we're seeing this from some politicians as well, right? The fact that we phrase it as the Green New Deal to try to make it sound really optimistic. There is source for optimism here if we can find it.
Yeah, harkens back to the point on the psychology of the matter, right? And when I think, again, not to beat the drum of Americanization, but if you talk to an American about some kind of like fear or like they become kind of like, all right, challenge accepted, right? Like I'm going to take this on, right? Whereas if it's
Yeah.
like opportunity, it's like, oh, let me invest in that, right? Like it
Well,
is very much how you kind of phrase the issue.
and this is so amazing to me always in that, I mean, America, at least in our idealized version of America, right? We have all this innovation. We have Silicon Valley. We have, right, all these entrepreneurs. We have these amazing ideas and creative people and great engineering and technology. But when I look at climate adaptation, I don't see that, right? What I see mostly is let's build a wall. And I think, really, in our creative country of all these amazing, thoughtful, creative, innovative minds, I'm just going to say creative like 8 times, creative minds, the best thing we could come up with was let's build a wall between us and the ocean. Like, how is that the best solution we could come up with? Like, why isn't there anything more interesting? The Dutch are floating houses, right? I mean, your house is built into a pit and it's on a raft, and when the water comes, your house literally floats up and then floats back down. Why aren't we doing anything like that? Anything,
Yeah.
not
How
maybe
have we
that,
not
but
gotten to
something on
Atlantis
that.
yet?
Yeah, how is that not exciting, right? How have we not recreated Venice? How have we not built, I don't know, anything exciting? I read a lot of science fiction, and I love science fiction because there's a lot of doom and gloom, but there's a lot of these hopeful ideas of what life could be like. And why not? And wouldn't that be more fun, right, to talk about in a planning meeting? Like, hey, how are we going to turn our town into an amazing utopia? Wouldn't that be so much more fun to talk about than how wide are we going to make the culvert to let the water drain out, right? Because I mean, that's important, but where is this optimism? So I always am amazed by that with American like can-do attitude. I think some of it comes down to our can-do attitude is very technology and engineering driven, right? We want to solve the problem with something we build physically. We don't want to solve the problem by changing social structures and building more affordable housing. Somehow that hasn't entered the solution. And yeah, I think there's a lot of room for that. And I'd love to see us leverage that side of the American ideation, right? There's a lot of negatives we can say about being an American and American ideals, but I think if we could, I don't know, somehow if we could tap into that.
So where do you think, so, I mean, I think we can kind of acknowledge to more or less of an extent that the federal government's kind of a mess. It seems almost like no matter who's in charge, it sometimes is a lot messier than others, but in terms of Congress particularly, right, it's a bit of a mess. And so where do you see, in the absence of any kind of sweeping reform on that level, do you see this happening as one-off sort of through states or county governments or even more local than the county level? Where do you kind of see the efforts to actually solve some of these issues or at least stop making them worse?
Yeah, I actually, local government has an incredible amount of control if they leverage it, right? I mean, they have the land use, the planning, the zoning, building code, like they have that authority if they want to use it. They don't always have the financial resources or the staff. And so that will continue to be a need for federal support, which I think we're starting to see more federal support, at least in terms of here's the dollars, if not in terms of here's the vision and the driving motivation. States are playing a big role. Many states are stepping up to this, and cities too, right? I mean, cities have long been leaders in climate change mitigation, right? Trying to reduce greenhouse gases. And I think we're seeing them be leaders in climate adaptation too, because at the end of the day, someone has to turn around and face those residents whose homes just flooded, right? Or who are experiencing the effects of climate change, and they don't have the luxury of ignoring that. So I think they have to take steps. Now, the dilemma is going to be that these local governments also have economic incentives to continue developing in ways that make money, as opposed to in ways that are safe in the long term, right? And anyone who is elected on a very short-term position may be thinking more about short-term re-election than about, if a disaster happens in 30 years, that's fine, I won't be in office. Yeah. So we have to find ways as voters and local residents to try to keep putting the pressure on local officials to think long-term, right? We have to express that that's what we want, as well as what maybe they morally should be doing.
Yeah. So you mentioned other states. Are our neighbors making good progress on this? Is there anything exciting that Delaware loves to be a copycat? We we ring the bell on being first that one time, but aside from that, we like to copy whatever everybody else is doing. So what are they doing around us?
New Jersey has this great buyout program. And one of the things, learning more about New Jersey's buyout program, I've been incredibly impressed by is the amount of money they put into conservation. I mean, they're putting hundreds of millions of dollars over the last several decades into purchasing and conserving open space in the country or in the state. And so in a state that is as developed as New Jersey, right, and that is very much trying to develop and is still, has an economic engine, they're also very concerned about open space. And so I was really impressed by that. And most of that funding came from bond measures. So it was the voters supporting this. So this is something where the public support has come for it. It wasn't just top down, it was actually supported widespread on the state. So I think I've been very impressed by that. In Virginia, there's a number of organizations who are doing some really great work. They have a lot of new coastal master plan. A new coastal master plan is underway in Virginia, and I'm really excited to see what comes out of that. I'm hoping it's very long-term. Some states have very short-term coastal master plans, and I think that doesn't help very much. So we need something that's 30 years or more out into the future, which makes sense, right? If we're going to sell homes with 30-year mortgages, we should be planning at least for the 30 years over which someone will be paying for that building. So we need that kind of planning. There's some great organizations. Wetlands Watch is doing great work in Virginia. They're doing some really innovative things, looking at legal tools they can use to help with major treat and to help use the land after. So if we do purchase a home and the homeowner moves away, what do you do with that open space? And they're working on some innovative legal tools to try to help conservation organizations do something effective with that land. Think about that. I know landscape architects who are working in a variety of states trying to come up with innovative ways to turn even small parcels into stormwater gardens, into educational spaces, into community spaces that are really effective. So I think there is a lot of, to go against what I just said, there is a lot of creativity happening at these small scales. And if we can leverage that and sort of showcase those and maybe scale them up, I think that'd be fantastic to see.
Yeah, so Beth is talking about, throughout the talk here, we've kind of been more focusing on private property, individual homeowners, individual flood insurance policies, and that kind of private infrastructure and private insurance or private coverage for private individuals, public coverage for private individuals. But she talks about public infrastructure and the impact that this is going to have. And I kind of want to tie this into our last question. In Delaware, we don't see the same degree of devastation that like New Jersey saw from Sandy or that Louisiana saw from Katrina, right? Like we see some impacts there. I don't want to diminish anybody that lived near the shore and the impact that they felt, but comparatively, right? We don't see those large scale disruptions that these other states have done. But we do see a lot of like sunny day flooding events, right? We do see a lot of impacts on public infrastructure, right? So I'd love to kind of hear your thoughts on how we can, what are the problems, the barriers / opportunities on that, and how can Delaware deal with that?
In some ways, I think the sunny day flooding, those repeated low-level flood events are actually more pernicious and problematic. Likewise, I don't want to just devalue anyone's experiences here, but I think it can be really pernicious. Like, think about, if you're building a road, okay, the road is going to be underwater every time a major hurricane comes through, every time a Category 4 hurricane comes through. Well, that'll be 6 days every 3 years. Okay, maybe we're just okay with that. Maybe we just accept that level of risk. This road will be shut down 3 days once a decade, or maybe twice a decade, whatever. But if you know that that road is going to flood every time it rains, or every time we get 4 inches of rain, and it won't be damaged, but it'll be flooded just enough to make it a real pain for everyone to drive through, or just enough that it'll be dangerous and shut off access to some community or some, then you have to do something about it. Like you can't just say, oh, we accept that level of low-lying flood. And these kinds of small floods also affect real estate and economic access, because if you can't get through a road, you're not getting to any of the businesses down that road. A colleague in North Carolina did some great work in Annapolis, Maryland, actually looking at how flooding of a parking lot affected all the businesses nearby. The parking lot floods, and so no one wants to park there, so no one shops at the nearby businesses. So every time it floods, which was a small amount, but very frequently, these businesses lost money. That might actually be a huge problem because they're not getting disaster payouts, they're not getting insurance claims, right? They're not having that sort of institutional infrastructure to help them deal with this. It just happens over and over and over again. If your front lawn floods, there's a community in Florida that had their front lawn flooded for 60 days in 2019, right? Can you imagine if you happen to be trying to sell your home at that time? How would anyone buy it? Are they going to pay asking price? Almost very certainly not, right? So how can these sort of repeated floods become a major problem? And this is a huge problem for any like Department of Transportation in Delaware, who suddenly has to start thinking about, can we afford to maintain all of the roads? Southern Florida, some of the counties in Southern Florida have come to the realization that they cannot afford to rebuild all the bridges, to rebuild all the roads, to elevate them all. They just do not have the money. This is not in the budget. So now you face a really difficult decision of which ones do we elevate? Yeah, or in Delaware, can we elevate them high enough? Some of the roads or evacuation routes have wetlands on either side of them, and you need a certain grade. You can't have it be too steep. So you can't just build up 15 feet on the road. You have to have a grade. So are we willing to give up the wetlands that we've been protecting in order to raise that road? And how much wetland are we willing to give up to raise that road, right? Or do we move to bridges, or do we, it becomes this really complicated calculation, right? Of which ones do we preserve? How much are we willing to try to raise them? Can we preserve them all? And how do we think about the longevity of, and one of the reasons this is problematic is that it's tied in with the public or with the private real estate. So in most states and in Delaware, if you have a community and the road is the one access point to that community, you can't decide not to maintain that road unless the community accepts responsibility for it, right? You are legally obligated to maintain access to that place. So every time we build new private real estate, we are also committing ourselves to the infrastructure, public infrastructure that goes to that private real estate forever. And we should be taking that forever really seriously when we're thinking about the future.
Yeah, I think unfortunately, we don't. I feel as though, and again, to kind of call back to some of the trainings that I've been in on recently around, infill development versus sprawl, and around developing green space versus putting more infrastructure into already developed areas, even if it's not really densely populated, where it's more kind of infilling rather than it is kind of additional developing. But we do kind of almost incentivize in a way, because of the way we disincentivize infill and developing where development exists, we thereby, and by proxy, kind of incentivize development out into green spaces. And particularly in Delaware, in a low-lying space state, a lot of those green spaces, right, really shouldn't be developed because they have a ecological function.
They're protecting other
homes.
Right,
to help protect the development that's over here, right? And so I think to a great extent, that's one thing that Delaware could be doing so much better. The county, Newcastle County, is in the midst of its comp plan, is talking about hazard mitigation and talking about development and how we manage our sprawl in the state. And so, but other counties, obviously Sussex County in particular, needs to really, as you said, think hard about that commitment that they're approving. Yeah, it's great that, it's my right, they own that land, right? They can put what they want on it. But the county does have an obligation, right? And yeah, maybe you'll tax the developer for that initial money, right? The initial infrastructure costs or upgrades that are needed, right? We do that sometimes, but we're not thinking, what if that developer goes away, right? That entity is not there in 30 years. There's no legal way that you're going to get any additional revenue to help offset those kind of climate related or just by fact flooding, increase in flooding frequency. You're never going to be able to go back to them, right? It's a one-shot deal. So the public's on the hook for the rest. So we had somebody ask a question that I can't believe I didn't think to ask. If people want, and this is from Erica on Facebook, if people want or communities want to start figuring out kind of what those practical choices look like for them now, where are the places that they can find those resources? If people want to educate themselves on this or educate their communities and come up with changes or adjustments together, where could they go to find that sort of stuff?
Yeah, well, all right, I'll make a pitch for the University of Delaware because So the University of Delaware is actually creating a climate hub. So we're trying to bring all of our climate experts together to put all of our data and our expertise in one area. So eventually the goal is, and this probably won't happen for a year or so, but eventually our goal is to have a sort of one-stop shop for communities who are trying to do better in Delaware. So that will be a resource. And there are lots of experts at UD who are working on this. I think some of the great mapping I've been seeing is coming out of the Delaware Geological Survey. So they're doing some really good flood mapping. So if you're interested in your flood awareness, on that, I'll just give a caveat. There are a lot of flood risk maps out there. The only ones that are legally binding on anyone appear to be the FEMA maps, right? So there are lots of maps out there that you can use to raise your awareness or to think about what you think the flood risk is, but those are not the same maps that then determine whether you have to buy flood insurance or whether the county has to do something. So just, I'm a lawyer, we have to draw that distinction, right? Certain maps have legal ramifications and certain ones are just sort of for your information. So there are lots of maps out there. First Street Foundation just put out a bunch of maps on flood factor and flood risk that are very much, yes, I mean, to the point in the chat, yes, the FEMA maps are often out of date. They are still the legal standard, unless the state or county has adopted something else. Those are still the standard and not any of these other services. But there are a lot of services out there that can help you think about your flood risk. So First Street Foundation does have some of these maps that have come out looking at their flood risk. The state has a number of maps on flood risk. The Natural Resources Defense Council has some good ones on flood risk and flood risk disclosure that are out there. And then actually, I should have said this one from the beginning, but if you're looking for things that your county can do in terms of planning or in terms of legal tools, Georgetown Climate Center has a whole climate adaptation clearinghouse. So they maintain climate adaptation plans, climate regulations, municipal, everything from all over the country. So there's tons of examples there. They have a whole toolkit and handbook on managed retreat that recently came out, and another one on equity and climate adaptation is supposed to be coming out soon. And also the Sabin Center of Climate Change at Columbia University. So Columbia University's Earth Institute will have quite a lot of resources. Sorry, I should have had that better organized in my head, but
no worries, no worries. Yeah, and you brought up an interesting point. So the county often approves, or the county does approve developments and land use and things of that nature. But yeah, she's right. And that the state often takes the right, DelDOT, right, takes on the costs of maintaining roads and having to rebuild things if a roadway needs to be shut down. We heard one instance, man, I wish I could remember what meeting we were on, but at any rate, the state was deciding that there was this development, right? There was this road that goes to this development, but there was two ways to get to it. You had this shortcut road here, but then you had this road that went out and over, right? But the shortcut road had a bridge that kept flooding and was breaking down over time. And the road was sunny day flooding like every other day. And it was just costing them a fortune to maintain this shortcut path, right?
Yeah.
And so they kind of got with the community and said, hey, look, we can't afford to keep fixing this road, right? And you have this alternative way to get to your residency. And the state basically told them, we're not doing it anymore. This road is now done, right? This shortcut road that you guys have been using to get to your development, we're not going to do it anymore. And it's shutting down, and they put blocks on both sides. And now the earth is kind of taking it back over. And we don't really do a great job, by the way, just to throw it out there, to allow the earth to take back. Like, we don't take up asphalt, right, and like return it back to the earth. We just say, we're done. And then the earth kind of does what it does. But yeah, that was a great point, Yoel, the good distinction again, as you were saying. So
just one thought on that. It is really key, like, to think about whenever we're thinking about the money we're going to put at any of this flood mitigation or elevating roads or any of this. It's always worth asking, what else could we do with that money instead, right? Would we rather invest it in the schools, in salaries for teachers or any other state employees? Would we rather repair roads somewhere else? Like, is there crumbling infrastructure somewhere else that would really rather put that money? Because there is an opportunity cost to all of this, right? We want to reduce this flood risk, but whenever we maintain that we are definitely going to protect this place at all costs, we should really be careful in thinking about what are the other costs, what are the other things that we're giving up the chance to do.
Great. So Shelley does have a question. I would rather not put that question on the spot on air, but I would like to stick around and provide her that opportunity to ask that. But if anybody had any additional questions, kind of now is the time, because I do want to stick to our 1 hour time period here. And I'm not seeing anything else on Facebook. So I do appreciate your time and what you're doing and the effort that you're making here in Delaware to kind of help educate the public and elected officials when they care to be educated on these issues. But Yul does actually have a good question here, and we'll wrap up on this, but Shelley, stick around. Should the county and cities, I'm going to actually rephrase this a little bit. Do other states require that counties and cities have their own resiliency funds, their own little piggy banks for these purposes? And if so, should Delaware do that? If not, should we start looking at that?
I haven't seen other states require it, but I do know localities that have their own resiliency funds. So for example, Charlotte Mecklenburg in North Carolina has a stormwater management fee that goes into a pot of money that they use to buy up flood-prone homes, move those homes, and return the land to open space so that it can help reduce flood risk and help protect other homes in the area. So they specifically self-fund that through a town, I don't know if they call it a resiliency fund, but they have their own fund for these kind of rainy day projects. I know other cities have the same type of allocation. So it is absolutely something worth thinking about for any town, village, or city that does not have one, to think about how they can take, because it gives them control, right? If they have their own source of funding, then they also have control over how they spend that money, and they don't have to answer to the state or feds, and they don't have to wait for the states and feds to take action. They can be progressive and do really creative things rather than waiting.
And there's nice things like we're seeing actually with the public water infrastructure bill that the House just voted on. Doesn't really deal with any of the private infrastructure stuff, but on the public side, they said we're going to create this piggy bank essentially to put money in. It's going to be used for public, water infrastructure and cleaning public waterways and things of that nature. And this now they're able, because they've set it aside and they get specifically allocated to that, then they can get federal matching funds. So I imagine it could be a similar situation on the more local level, right? That if they had dedicated funding, dedicated piggy bank, that they would be able to apply for some of those matching funds too.
Absolutely.
So that's great. Well, I appreciate everybody on Facebook. I am going to end the Facebook feed now. So thank you guys for watching.